great speaker, another great topic. Professor Villano is here with us, and if you don't mind just saying a few words about yourself and then jumping into the topic, I would appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
First of all, it's good to be here with you all. Hopefully you all can hear me okay, I hope. Great, excellent. I'm okay if you guys are fine and it picks everything up fine. I'm used to doing it, so I have no problem speaking, I guess, at this volume. I'm Professor Villano. A little bit about my background for you guys. I have a PhD in experimental or legal psychology from Florida International University, where I studied things such as eyewitness memory, police interviewing, identification issues, all that kind of stuff. I teach mainly at the Greensburg campus, but I also teach over here the psychology and law courses, including one in the law school as well. And I've testified about eyewitness memory issues quite a bit over the past few years, in particular, ever since, if you guys are familiar with the Commonwealth versus Walker, which was a case in 2014 that allowed for expert testimony on eyewitness memory and identification. So that's generally my background. I was in law school as well, so I have some kind of basic legal training, I guess you guys could say. Most of you would understand that the first year of law school tends to give you the ability to read cases and that kind of thing. But I moved on from that to later get a PhD that was a little bit more in line with what I would like to do. So I'm going to talk to you guys about eyewitness memory and police interviewing today. And I'm just going to try to kind of give you guys a general overview to help you be more knowledgeable about some of the issues that you may face if you have any types of cases, whether it be criminal or civil. By the way, this is pretty generally applicable to really both cases here. I am going to focus mostly on cooperative adults, so I'm not really going to kind of focus a whole lot on children, although really good interviewing strategies I think generally apply pretty well to children. I'm going to keep it with cooperative adults, so people that police don't think are maybe suspects to the crime or something that sort. And I'm also going to focus mostly on what we call recall in the literature. So eyewitness recall is where you're kind of giving your free report of what you remember without any particular prompt. So a recognition task would be if somebody showed you a picture and they said, have you seen this person before? And can you identify who this person is? I'm going to stick more with recall, where you're just essentially reporting what you can remember about the criminal event or any other type of event as well. So I'll go over things like just how generally memory works, which will really give you guys the foundation, I think, to evaluate how police interviews can affect the quality of an eyewitness's memory report. What are good and poor interviews? And what are good, poor interviewer characteristics? What's a good police interviewer? What's a not so good one? What's a good interview? What's a bad interview? So I'll kind of touch upon that as well. And then just try to give you guys some practical tips for if you have cases that involve these kinds of things, whether it be civil or criminal. You know, how can you kind of deal with this? How can you better assess whether or not the memory reports may be more or less reliable, that sort of thing. And if you guys have questions as I'm talking about this stuff, I'm fine taking questions as I'm talking about it, or if you want to wait until later, either way is fine with me. I'm pretty used to the either way you guys want to do it here. Okay. Do you guys mind if I test your memory real quick? Is that all right? Can I do this? Is that still a professional enough thing to do where I can do this with you guys? All right. So you guys have some type of something to write with or something somewhere. I'm not going to tell you to write yet. So just need to know that you have something that you can write with. Okay. I'm just going to read you guys a list of words. Listen to the words. I will tell you in a few minutes that I will ask you to write down all the words that you remember. So just listen at this point in time. All right. Rest, doze, snore, bed, tired, wake, nap, awake, dream, peace, snooze, drowsy, yawn, blanket, and slumber. I realize that's a lot of words. We'll see. You guys are all very smart attorneys. I'm sure this will be very easy for you guys once I ask you to write this down. So just bear with me here for just a second. Okay. I want to talk about just one of my favorite all-time studies about eyewitness memory in general. Elizabeth Loftus, you may have heard her name before somewhere down the line. She is one of the pioneers of memory research, primarily starting in the 1970s. She did this fascinating study in 1974 where she showed participants slides of a car accident, okay? Kind of like what this picture is depicting. Everybody saw the identical slide of the car accident happening, right? And what she did is she manipulated how she asked people to rate how fast the cars were going. Okay, so what she did is simply this. She said, how fast were the cars going when they either smashed into each other for some people? For the other people, she said, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? So very kind of simple, just a one-word manipulation. Some people got the smashed question, some people got the hit question, right? What did she find? The smashed people said about 41 miles per hour, right? Change it to hit, you get 34 miles an hour. I mean, think about that. What are the implications of that, right? If you think about that, broadly speaking, you can just change one word in how you ask somebody a question, and that can significantly influence the information that you get. It's kind of amazing when you think about the possibilities there. Another really interesting aspect of this study was she showed them a car accident where there was no broken glass present during the crime. But she asked people, did you see broken glass during the time of the crime? Okay. So she asked them that, and here's what she found. The smashed people, 32%, said that they saw broken glass when there was, in fact, no broken glass. The hit people, 14%. Notice that none of these are zero, first of all, right? So both groups are finding something that didn't necessarily happen, but even the word choice here affects what it is that you think happened that actually didn't happen. Now, some people will just kind of believe that this happened. They will say, yeah, I think that this happened, but I'm not really sure, right? Other people will engage in what we call a rich false memory, where they'll have an actual image of this happening when it didn't actually happen, which are much more interesting, right? I think that the idea that somebody could create a memory that really never existed in the first place. So go ahead and write down all the words you guys can remember at this point. Giving you a few minutes here. As many words as you can remember from the list I gave you. Of course, if you're talking about visual memory for a crime, it'd be pretty rare that anybody would ever recall information this quickly, of course, right? So you guys should be in your, kind of your best shape here for your performance, right? But it was a lot of words, right? So individual differences in memory, no doubt. So I want to see how well you guys did here. So first word on the list was rest. How many of you had rest? Just show of hands, okay. So far, so good, looking good. Slumber, last word on the list. How many of you had slumber on your list? Okay. First and last words of lists tend to be recalled better than the ones in the middle. This is called the primacy and recency effect, by the way. Sleep, how many of you had sleep? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay. It wasn't on here. So, it wasn't on. You can check me if you think I would deceive you. I would never do such a thing, by the way. It is not in fact on this list. This is a very easy trick, by the way. It's a fun one to do. So 7 out of, like, how many of you are here? Like 20-ish, something like that? That's about what they find when they do studies on this. So this is from something called the DRM paradigm, which is in the mid-90s, where they have a set of word lists that are all kind of surrounding the same kind of concept, and they want to see how many people will report a critical lore, which in this case was sleep, right? Some of you may have even heard me saying this word, by the way, right? That's confabulation or rich false memory, essentially, where you actually can hear me saying this word that I didn't actually say, right? Well, of course this is problematic, not very difficult to do, right? It's even more problematic when people are highly confident about their memories, right? In my line of work, right, if you're an eyewitness and you go to the witness stand and you say, yeah, it was him, I'm not really that sure about it though, maybe not, right? But typically, at least the cases I've seen, people are highly confident in what it is that they've seen. So it really makes it much more problematic if people are highly confident, and sometimes that can in fact happen, as we know all too well, right? So we'll talk about kind of what are some of the, particularly the police interviewing strategies that can kind of lend themselves to these particular problems, but not hard to do, right? You see how easy that can be for sure, right? So whenever I talk about this stuff, you guys always like to remind people that memory is not horrible, okay? So that it is not my belief that memories are always wrong and that eyewitnesses can never be accurate in their recollections of criminal events. And in some cases, they can be quite good, right? So, I mean, I think it's good to kind of keep in mind that we're certainly not suggesting that eyewitnesses are never accurate and everybody falls prey to these kinds of techniques. Because even in some of the studies, it may be 25 to 30% or something around that nature of people who are falling prey to suggestive techniques and things like that. But it's certainly substantial enough that we ought to be very careful about how we do things, especially when we're talking about police interviews, right? So we know that memory can fail us. These can have really significant consequences. Very briefly, Elizabeth Loftus did another really interesting study in the 90s where she suggested to adults that their parents had said that they were lost in the mall as children, okay? She gave them 3 additional descriptions of things that actually happened to the children, but she added one on there that said you were lost in the mall as a child, wanted to see how many people would actually say that they were in fact lost in the mall. And a significant percentage of people in fact did say that they were lost in the mall. Some of them could even come up with details about the event itself, right? Which ostensibly never happened, right? This person saw me and they had this type of shirt on and they took me into this other room. So that people could provide details even when things aren't necessarily the case, when things never actually happened. And I think one of the things you want to know about memory is it's a very active kind of organism here, right? A lot of times when we think about memory, we think of it as kind of a passive storehouse of information, where if we have a memory, we just kind of pull it out of a file in our memory and it's untainted, undistorted over time. But that's not at all how memory actually works. And if you try to think of, for instance, your last birthday, you realize that you don't really have a complete videotaped recollection of it. You kind of pull from the bits and pieces that you know now, and you try to fill in the gaps, right? You try to kind of fill in the gaps with what you know now, and what is your current state, what's your current context, right? Thus, when you think about something like police interviewing, you got to be really careful because that's when you're actually pulling the memories out. So the way in which you do that can affect the quality of the recollections that you get, right? In a lot of our work, we often distinguish between what we call system and estimator variables. So Gary Wells, a long time ago, said that there are some variables that the legal system has no control over, right? An eyewitness who views a crime, you can't control the view that they had of the perpetrator. You can't control how much attention they were paying to the perpetrator, right? That would be what we call an estimator variable. We can only really estimate the influence of that variable on the potential accuracy of an eyewitness. But system variables, that's what law enforcement does have control over, right? So the way that you interview eyewitnesses, there is control over the methods and the techniques that you use to do this kind of thing. So often we get a little bit more focused on system variables because you can have some influence or impact on them, right? So how does memory actually work, you guys? What are the kind of processes of memory that I think would be helpful to know? You have encoding. So encoding is, you can think of it almost sequentially as when do you first take in information about the event, and that starts with encoding, right? So that's when you try to put information into your memory that you've witnessed. There's way more than, I mean, I could have, an 8-hour lecture about all of the estimator variables and how they could potentially affect memory. So a little bit beyond the scope of what I'll talk about today, but things like view, attention, stress, that kind of thing. Storage, when you're trying to keep the information in your memory. So encoding is where you're putting it into your memory. Storage is where you try to keep it in your memory for later retrieval, right? You got to pull it out at some later date. When people store memories, right, the passage of time can be harmful to those memories, okay? But it's not just about time. I think the key point with storage is that it's not just about the sheer length of time that makes memory recall necessarily problematic. It's what happens in that particular period of time, right? Have they talked to somebody else about the crime? Have they gotten other information about a crime that could distort what it is that they're talking about? So it's not just that memory decay over time is an issue. It's often more that there's some type of interference about what people are trying to report, okay? And so we'll talk a little bit about time. One of the, I think, kind of surprising things about eyewitness recall accuracy is this, that if you look at eyewitness recall accuracy over time, their actual percentage of accurate details that they report don't necessarily decline per se, okay? The quantity of information often does. The amount of information that they report might somewhat decline, but not necessarily the accuracy of what they're reporting. And I'll try to talk about a little bit about why that can be in some cases, okay? Retrieval is when you're trying to pull that information out of your memory, and we'll talk about police interviewing particularly and how that kind of plays a role here, okay? Let's shift gears to that critical question, this police interview, okay? What's law enforcement trying to do typically, okay? Well, they're trying to do a few things, right? They're trying to get as many investigatory leads as they possibly can, right? They want information to find whoever the criminal is, to solve the crime. So they're trying to get as much information as they can, but they're also wanting to get only accurate information, right? In a perfect world, the eyewitness provides all kinds of amazing details and it's all perfectly accurate, so they're not running around trying to find the wrong person, basically, right? So it's pretty, I guess, kind of clear and self-explanatory what they're trying to do. I think what's not so clear is what's going on in an eyewitness's mind when they're trying to recall information about the crime. This is where it gets kind of interesting, right? Eyewitnesses certainly try to access their memory of the criminal event, right? They try to pull up what they can actually remember in their mind's eye, if you will, about the event, okay? But they also make decisions about what they report. That's something that you don't necessarily, it's not intuitive to think about it, right? We I think intuitively often think that eyewitnesses just say everything they could possibly think about. That's not necessarily the case, okay? What eyewitnesses often try to do is when they're deciding what to report, they're kind of using what we call metacognitive processes. They're using internal cognitive mechanisms to decide what it is that they're actually going to report, okay? So what they may think about is, how sure am I that this actually happened for me to report it to the police? Because most eyewitnesses are somewhat sensitive to that. They have some type of internal threshold where they say, if it meets my confidence threshold, then I will report it. If not, I will withhold it. Okay? So that's what eyewitnesses will often do. So this notion of eyewitnesses just say everything that may have possibly occurred is probably a faulty perception of what they actually do. They have to decide what it is that they're going to report, right? And most of them try to maintain accuracy, okay? And they do this in a few ways, right? What they'll do is they'll maintain accuracy by saying, well, if I'm not really that sure, I just won't say it, right? So they'll withhold information that they're uncertain about, okay? Or what they'll do, especially over time, is they'll be less precise in what they're saying. Because they have a choice in how precise they are, right? I mean, think about if they're describing how tall the perpetrator is, right? I mean, they could say 5'10", but they could say, from 5'8" to 6 foot, right? They're thinking about these kinds of things as they try to report this information, and they're trying to be as accurate as possible. And people, if you leave them alone, are generally pretty good at doing this, okay? The problem is you gotta leave them alone. You gotta let them do their own thing, memorially speaking, so that way that you don't disrupt their natural memory processes. So people can be generally accurate if you just kind of leave them alone and let them tell you what they know. But they're doing this internally, right? They're thinking about, do I want to report that or not, based upon how confident am I that what I'm reporting is accurate. So that's just a kind of a general overview of what's going on, but you don't often think about the internal kind of confidence that they have and how that plays a role. Certainly how you interview them plays a role, right? So let's look at this. This is a not too uncommon, I guess you could say, police interview here. Hi, I have a lot of work to do, so just tell me what happened. Okay, I saw two cars. One of them went through a stoplight, ran into this blue Honda, I think, and then the officer interrupts and says, hold on. A car ran into another car and then left the scene, right? I think so. Well, the one car ran through the stoplight when interruption. Wait, can you give me your name for the record? Sarah? Okay, where were you standing? I wasn't really standing. Leave it for now. Another witness told me that the driver that fled had blonde hair and sunglasses and drove a Honda Civic. Is that right? How do you guys feel about this police interview? Not so atypical. What do you guys think? What are your thoughts? Any, what's
leading the witness?
Leading the witness, perhaps, right? So, especially if you look at the last question here, right? Another witness told me that the driver that fled had blonde hair and sunglasses and drove a Honda Civic, right? Suggestive leading question, right? You're providing information that they may not otherwise necessarily have, right? And suggesting the right answer, by the way, right? So you're also doing that. What else do you like or dislike about this interview? If you're looking at this just commonsensically, what are you seeing that you're...
I didn't like the way he interrupted her flow of thinking. Like, she was trying to pull up the memory and he cut her off.
So one of the things that can be really detrimental is when you ask the witness that first question, which is really, really an important question, just to get their general free recall. If we look at what actually happens with police interviews, in many of them, you'll find an interruption fairly quickly into the middle of their recall, right? That's what you don't want to do, right? You don't want to interrupt the witness, right? Who's the expert here? Yeah, right? The witnesses, but is it often reversed, right? Where the police officer or the detective interviewing says, I need this information, I'm going to get it the way that I want to get it. It should be flipped, right? It should be exactly the opposite to that. What else do you see here? They build a good rapport beforehand? Yeah. Yeah, what else?
In the beginning, it seems like the Honda was the car that's hit, and at the end, it sounds like the Honda's the one that fled. I don't know. It's sort of unclear on both ends, but it seems like it's leaning towards that.
Yeah, so there's some kind of inconsistencies here in what's going on as well, right? Not a whole lot of rapport building, by the way, right? It wasn't like they said, let's just take a minute to get to know you first. They went kind of right into this and said,
Then I have a lot of work to do.
I've got stuff to do here. I can't be taking all this time to be developing rapport here and to be really concerned about what you have to say, right? Doesn't that affect people? Haven't you had conversations just in general where people say this kind of stuff and you think, oh, well, I'm not going to go into this, right? Because they don't have time and they're not interested in hearing what I have to say. So you lose information that way. Anything else you see here that you're not a big fan of?
Kind of cuts her off and then makes it more general. She's being specific, and he makes her statement much more general.
Yep. So it does go from basically what we'll talk about as witness compatible questioning, right? If somebody's talking about a particular event or thing in their mind, you should not shift what they're talking about, right? Which you kind of see kind of similar to what you're saying, right? Starts talking about what happened at the scene and then says, oh, well, wait, can I get your names? I need to write this down, right? Stop what you're thinking about and shift your focus to something else, right? This is not atypical by any means, right? This can be, it often doesn't get a whole lot of press, especially when it comes to adult cooperative witnesses. I think you hear a lot more about it when it comes to child interviews and things like that, but adults are, arguably just as crucial, depending upon what it is that you're talking about. So this isn't, horribly atypical. Certainly some are better and some are good, but certainly we will see some that are like this, okay? This is what you don't want, right? You don't want a directive interviewer who says they need this information. You don't want a very talkative interviewer. Really, the interviewer shouldn't really be talking much at all, right? They should be asking just a few questions and sitting back and just listening to what the person is saying, right? Don't want impatience. You don't want inflexibility, right? In fact, a good interviewer is very flexible. They're adaptive to what it is that the person is talking about, and that if they do ask any questions, that they're open-ended and that they're consistent with what the person is talking about. So it shouldn't be a rigid, here are the questions and here are the pieces of information that I need, and I don't want to deviate from that particular course, right? That shouldn't be how it's done. Not empathic, right? It might even help to build rapport. I'll talk about that here in a second. Why are there these types of interviews? Why is this all too frequent that this happens? I have some ideas about this, okay? It's hard. It's really hard to do. I think number one, to be a good interviewer requires a lot of patience, it requires a lot of flexibility, requires time, right? It requires a lot of skills that the average person doesn't necessarily have, doesn't even necessarily want to have, I would say, okay? Inadequate training. One of the really interesting things we found, Ron Fisher and Naja Schreiber-Campo here found not too long ago that the training per year was, maybe, 10 to 20 hours or something like that per year on interviewing. And you also have to consider, well, who is doing the training? Is it a law enforcement official that isn't necessarily trained in best practice and just has experience doing this kind of thing? Or is it somebody that's trained in kind of basic memory principles, that kind of thing as well? So it's not a whole lot of training. I mean, a lot of times we're just not putting people in the best position to maybe do as good of a job as they otherwise could, right? So inadequate training, lack of uniform protocol across jurisdictions. This is another one that sometimes this is more of a US problem than in European countries. Like the UK does a pretty good job with police interviewing because they have a centralized government where they can kind of more or less mandate what interviewing techniques are used. But here, every police department is going to be, dramatically different in what they do. And as far as I know, there's no legal mandate saying you have to interview witnesses one particular way or another. So what you see from Department A and Department B could vastly differ over time just due to these kinds of jurisdictional differences, for sure, right? So how do you actually interview eyewitnesses, adult eyewitnesses, most effectively? Well, here's the answer. Here's the best answer that we have. It's something called the cognitive interview. See Ron Fisher up here to the top left, Ed Geiselman to your right. They came up with this protocol actually in the 80s. So this has been around a long time. And in fact, I know Ron, he was a former professor of mine. He does all kinds of training all throughout the United States with all kinds of organizations to teach law enforcement and others about the cognitive interview, but it's still not horribly well integrated, arguably, right? So there's a few kind of principles about the CI that it tries to capitalize on to make people better interviewers, okay? It deals with social dynamics, okay? How can we set the table so that the interviewer-interviewee interaction is a good one? It's a positive one that is going to be a fruitful relationship. Are there memory-enhancing techniques that we can use and we can pull from in cognitive psychology, just basic cognitive psych, to help increase quantity and accuracy? And then maybe there are some instructions that we can give to increase the amount of information and get the most information out of witnesses as possible. So I'll go through just kind of briefly what some of these are. Okay. The first thing you'll want to do is to build some type of rapport. Okay? If you watch some real police interviews, this doesn't always happen. In the real world, there's often a lot of let's get straight to the point and let's get this thing going. But actually building a comfortable environment, we found, myself and others in particular, have found that building this comfortable environment can actually help eyewitnesses report more information and be less suggestible. So that kind of thing can happen just by taking even 5 minutes or something to just build a relationship and to show somebody that you care about what they have to say, and do a little bit of small talk before you go right in to the interview. So something as simple as that can be really beneficial, and to not interrupt when you're listening to people about what their life is like, and just when you're getting that basic information from them, to just listen to them, right? To not interrupt them. Okay, so build a good rapport. This is a big one, right? Active participation, or what we call transferring control to the eyewitness. Okay, letting the witness explicitly know that you're the expert. You're the one that knows about what happened. I don't know. I wasn't there, right? So giving an instruction like that, you saw what happened, so I expect you to tell me what happened without waiting for me to ask questions, right? You're explicitly transferring that control to the eyewitness so that they know they're in charge here. I'm just going to sit back and listen, and maybe fill in the gaps way at the end, towards the end of the interview. Report everything instructions. So tell me everything you can remember, no matter how trivial. In typical conversations, we don't necessarily think to do that. So this instruction is important to actually get people to say anything that they can think of, right? A few years ago, I went to my doctor and I was describing symptoms of something, right? And I remember him vividly telling me, I said, well, I have a headache. And he said, well, I'm not that kind of doctor. So why are you telling me this, basically, right? It's like I'm supposed to know what the symptoms are for all these different possible diagnoses. So I said, well, I just won't say things I don't think are relevant, I guess. I just will say less, right? That's not what you want, right? Because you don't want the eyewitness screening what information they're going to convey to you, because they may have some pretty valuable information that could really help you, right? So you don't want to do that, right? But you don't want them to guess, right? Again, metacognitively, people are pretty good at outputting more or less accurate information most of the time. You don't want them to just speculate and throw out everything out there that they could possibly think of. You do want them to still use their metacognitive processes as they're good at doing. So don't tell them to just guess and say whatever frivolous thing comes to mind as well. So you got to be a little bit careful about that. Promote focused concentration. I want you to think very hard and be as detailed as possible, right? People don't, again, always think in typical conversations about being incredibly detailed. Sometimes you need to tell them to be able to get more detailed information out of them, otherwise they just won't do it, right? So asking them or giving that instruction for them to be more detailed can really be beneficial. So before you're going to ask them specifically about the event in question, one of the things we found to be pretty effective is something called context reinstatement. To me, this is another one of those, I think, really interesting things about memory, okay? Which says this, it says, when we remember information, when we encode and take in information, we don't just take in the words that I'm saying to you, right? When you're in this room, you're listening to me, you can hear the words that I'm saying, but you're encoding how the desk feels, how the chair feels, the lighting around you, whatever your internal state is at the time. All of this stuff is being encoded at the same time that the content is being encoded. And what context reinstatement is, it says that if we can reinstate that same both internal and external context when we ask you about the crime, that can help jog your memory for things that otherwise you wouldn't have thought about, right? Think about, you ever hear a song on the radio? Or not even, nobody listens to radio anymore, basically, right? It's a bad example, right? But if you listen to music or something, right, and you hear a song that takes you back to, a long time ago, do you ever feel a certain way about this, right? You think about things that maybe you wouldn't have thought about otherwise, right? It jogs your memory in ways where it makes you think about things that you hadn't thought about in years. Maybe things that you'd never really thought about for years at all, and then you think, man, I forgot about that. I never realized that happened, right? What does that tell us about memory, you guys? It tells us that most of the time we're not forgetting, per se, right? It's in there oftentimes. It's about how do we get it out, right? And what retrieval cues can we use to best get at this memory without interfering with people's memory? It's kind of an amazing thing when you think about it. So reinstate the context. You can't take people back to the actual crime scene, or at least they don't most of the time, but you can at least instruct them to start thinking about all of the five senses that occurred at the time that they were witnessing the crime. And we recently found that eye closure can even augment those benefits. So just having people close their eyes as they're recalling the event can help even more people to recall more information about the crime, right? When it comes to the actual questions, one of the really important things to know about a good interview is that most questions are going to be open-ended. The majority of the questions, in fact, are going to be very open-ended, okay? And when we talk about open-ended questions, we mean where you provide no prompts whatsoever. You provide no information other than, tell me about the event. Something as simple as that, right? And what you can follow up with is, what else can you remember about this event, right? That's a very open-ended type of question where you're getting what we call free recall from the eyewitness, and just to let them go, basically. Most of the questions should be like that until they've just totally exhausted all of their cognitive ability or what they can remember, and then you can start filling in the gaps with more open-ended, but maybe more what we call cued questions, where maybe you say, tell me more about the perpetrator's face or something like that, when they're actually talking about that. So you want it to be compatible with what the witness is talking about, right? So most of it's going to be open-ended. It's really, I mean, when you think about it, it's kind of simple yet complex, I guess you could say, right? It's I guess generally easy to ask open-ended questions, but it's hard to be constantly patient and flexible while you're doing it, okay? So open-ended questions, no prompts, okay? Cued questions, the reason why cued questions we gotta be careful with is because especially if it's a cued closed question, was the car black or silver, you might introduce information that in fact they didn't know about, right? So you gotta be really, really careful about doing that or introducing information they didn't know about. This one happens quite often generally. Complex questions, have you seen questions like this? Did you see the car and the gun, right? It's like, well, if they say yes, is it to the car, is it to the gun, right? You can't really know that kind of thing, right? So to be more precise in the questions that you ask people and to separate out what we call double-barreled questions, right? So you gotta be careful about that as well. Okay. So when you're asking them or when you're questioning them about their particular recall, tell them to report everything like we talked about. Let the eyewitness know it's okay to say, I don't know, right? You wanna let them know explicitly it's okay to say, I don't know. You don't want them to feel like they have to introduce information to you because you're asking them about something, right? So it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I don't understand, right? Because the interviewer's question certainly could be difficult to understand or interpret, right? Use witness-compatible questioning, as I told you as well. Okay? So after you're done with that recall and after you're done with most of the questions, there are other ways you can kind of jog people's memory in some cases. One of them is by asking them to recall the story in reverse chronological order. And the way that this can help is that it changes people's cognitive perspective. It makes them think about things differently, so other details might pop into their mind because they're using more or less a different way of thinking about the crime. Same thing with changed perspective, right? So there's a famous study that had people read a story about, something that like a burglar did. And it asked people to recall the information from a burglar's perspective or from another person's perspective that was there. And doing that helped them recall more information than just having them recall it by one particular perspective. So changing perspectives, making them think about maybe the other eyewitness's perspective during the time of the crime can get more information as well, right? So changing their perspective can help get more information. Okay? Then once they're all set, once they're all done summarizing the account, eyewitnesses don't shut their brain off when you're done asking them questions, right? As none of us do, right? Sometimes we wish we did more than we do, right? So they're still thinking about that crime. So when you're summarizing and kind of reporting back to the eyewitness what it is that they recalled, sometimes that can make them think of other things, right? And if you're in a low pressure environment, they may feel comfortable to tell you more about what they're currently recollecting about the crime, right? Can serve as an additional retrieval attempt. Provide contact information, right? Because certainly afterwards, eyewitnesses may remember other things that they didn't previously remember, okay? So does this work? I mean, I spent at least, not a ton of time, but I spent 10 to 15 minutes or so talking to you about the CI. Yeah, it has been shown to be probably the most effective way for interviewing adult cooperative witnesses. What it's typically compared to is a standard police interview, by the way, right? So a lot of these studies have looked at, well, what do police normally do? And how does this compare to the CI, which includes all the different techniques that I've told you about? So it gets a little bit more murky to figure out each particular technique's, specific effects and how powerful each effect is when you're looking at two things that are kind of including a lot of stuff. But subsequent studies have gone back and pulled out things like eye closure. Let's see if we just add eye closure to the CI, will that help? And that's what we're doing. That's what a lot of the research has found. So adding incrementally those particular techniques is helpful. Yeah.
I was curious if, I imagine these events often involve emotionally highly charged scenarios with perhaps blood or gore, injuries or children or whatever. And if that makes a difference in the technique that you would apply.
That's a great question. It depends on, I think some people would say if it's a really traumatic event, you might be better off waiting a little while before you conduct the interview. So in that case, you might be better off just waiting until the emotion has died down some if you want to get a better recollection. So that'd be my general thoughts on it. I couldn't go too much beyond that, though. Yeah, it's a great question. You guys have other questions while I'm talking about this? If you do, feel free. So it's pretty good, and what it specifically does, it increases the number of details without sacrificing the accuracy of the information provided compared to that standard interview. Okay, so and it has also been shown to be especially useful for the very young, the very old population, as well as sometimes the cognitively impaired as well. So it's probably the most studied. It's probably the most empirically studied interviewing technique that we have with cooperative eyewitnesses. And I don't know what you guys work on as attorneys. I didn't get a chance to ask you guys that, whether it's like criminal or civil or whatever you're working on. But a lot of these principles generally apply to any type of event, essentially, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a crime event, right? This is really speaking to generally how memory works and how we can get the best information about any eyewitness to any type of event, criminal or otherwise, right? So it all generally applies, I would say. Okay. So what happens afterwards, after the interview? The police officer often will write a report, right? In the cases that I've been a part of, I don't think I've ever seen any video recorded police interviews, at least not many of them, at least with adults. I don't think I can recall seeing a whole lot of them. So one of the things you have to consider is that you're relying upon what the police officer is writing down about what it is that the witness recollected. And you got to be a little bit careful with that. Amy Hyman Gregory did a study where she was essentially looking at what police officers recorded about the interviews. And what they didn't often record were the types of questions that they asked, so you couldn't really evaluate very well what types of questions, were they good, were they bad questions, that kind of thing. And then there were more kind of errors of omission, if you will, where they didn't write down exactly everything that was reported, right? Often because if you think about it as a practical matter, when either detectives or police officers are taking reports, they're often writing it down as they're listening to it. So it kind of makes sense that they might miss some things along the way. So it may not be necessarily the eyewitness's recollection that's in question, but what did the police officer document about what it is that they said, right? Then sometimes the police description is used to search for the suspect, right? But of course, the amount of information and the accuracy of that information is going to have a profound impact on who it is that they look for, right? If that information isn't quality information, they might find somebody that's not necessarily the best fit or the actual perpetrator, right? They may create a composite sketch. Have you guys ever seen composite sketches before, right? Some research that's a little bit skeptical of their utility because what they can sometimes do is serve as a form of misinformation where It's not exactly what the person looked like, but then it becomes an image in somebody's mind of what the perpetrator actually looked like when it isn't a very viable sketch. So those you have to, take with, be very careful about how you use them. And the other thing I think is really useful to think about is that people aren't typically very good at describing facial features, okay? When you think about, if you think about somebody that you know really well, think about even a family member, and if you had to describe what they looked like, you probably wouldn't be very good at it, right? Because our brain doesn't tend to work that way with faces. Faces we tend to process more, what we say, holistically, where we kind of see it all at once. We don't see the parts and pieces as much. We just kind of see it all pop out to us. So when you're trying to describe facial features and details, we don't have a lot of great words for it either, probably because our brain doesn't really work that way very effectively. So that also makes you be very careful about what are the details that they are actually reporting, and how precise are they about what they actually saw and who the person is, right? Do judges and jurors and all of us, for that matter, do we have misperceptions about memory? Yeah, I think we have several of them that are, I think, of more practical use, okay? I've kind of touched upon this first one, that witnesses just report everything that comes to mind. Not necessary, right? They're going to try to report most of the time what they think is most accurate, okay? Without sacrificing accuracy, but providing maybe less details or maybe less precise details. So they will often do that kind of thing. Time harms recall accuracy. This is a really interesting one. It comes up all the time when you talk about cases or people that have recollections over, course of weeks, months, and years, right? I mean, the intuitive idea is that recall accuracy just gets totally worse over time. Not necessarily, okay? More the quantity of information, the number of details that you're reporting gets lesser over time. But the accuracy of it, not necessarily. There are definitely studies that will find that if we look at recall at time 1 and time 2, so maybe time 1 was quickly after the crime, time 2 was a long time after it, that accuracy will be fairly comparable. And this will be because, again, eyewitnesses will say at time 2, later on, well, I just won't report stuff that I'm not sure about. And if I do report it, I'll report it in a less precise manner. I won't be as specific about what it is that I saw. So that might kind of account for this really perplexing kind of idea as to why we can still maintain fairly decent accuracy over time. Of course, this doesn't account for, poor police interviews and, kind of using other techniques like misinformation that gets in the way, right? That can always be problematic, but that is still somewhat of a general misconception. The next one's kind of interesting too. You see this a lot in actual cases, I suspect, where you have witnesses who are inconsistent in what they're giving you, right? Where maybe when the eyewitness is first interviewed, they give you 20 details of information, and then the second time, maybe they give you 30 details. Well, are people skeptical of this? People question this? Yeah, the research shows us that they are, right? People think, well, why didn't you report it the first time? What's going on here, right? Well, everything I've told you about memory should suggest that this can happen, right? That it depends upon the circumstances and the context that you're in upon that second interview that could produce more information, could produce less, right? So people can actually report not only more information at time 2, but they can report new details that they never reported at time 1. That's not an uncommon scenario. In fact, I would say it's probably a little bit more uncommon for somebody's recall to be almost identical over time. You don't think about it. I mean, it makes sense when I'm saying it, but if you're the average juror, you're the average fact finder, judge, something like that, you might not really think about it that way. So it's not that the memory is necessarily flawed. And that's not to say that everybody's stories is going to be vastly different, right? It often becomes more of a gist kind of memory later on where you're providing less specific details over time, right? So you're not saying that the core details are fundamentally different, but what we are saying is that, inconsistencies aren't all that uncommon, I guess you could say, right? You wouldn't think about it that way, right? Highly confident eyewitnesses are always accurate eyewitnesses. The reason to mention confidence, and I talk about this a lot when I've dealt with eyewitness memory cases is that confidence is hugely persuasive to jurors. It's one of the most persuasive things about any type of eyewitness testimony, right? And certainly we know that confidence is a far from perfect indicator of accuracy. In many cases, it can be a really poor indicator of accuracy. And I've looked at this more with recognition or identification stuff, where that happens. That's a much more common kind of query, you know, when you have an identification and somebody outputs their confidence, right? What often happens with confidence that's really problematic is that often we don't get confidence when we're getting the recall attempt, right? So when people report what they remember, or if people make an identification, what often happens is that if you don't get their actual confidence right then, and you get it late, let's say, right? Confidence can go up. And confidence can go up for a host of reasons. Maybe they get some type of feedback about their recall, right? Maybe as the officer is taking the notes, as they're describing the perpetrator, they may say, oh, good job, that sounds right, and things like that. Those kinds of things can inflate confidence, but accuracy stays the same, right? Accuracy can't go up, they've already reported it, but confidence can inflate, and then that's what they later report. And that can be, of course, hugely persuasive and problematic, right? The same variables that affect recall also affect recognition. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that most of what I've talked about is more a recall issue than necessarily a recognition or identification issue. They can be separate, they can be very similar. It all depends on what the particular system or estimator variable is as to what kind of effect that will have. Okay? Sometimes you can see fairly similar results. Just some practical considerations to think about in these types of cases. I think there's just a few ones to highlight. There's a bunch of stuff on this slide. I apologize for that. What training did the police interviewer receive, and do they have experience with using the cognitive interview? I mean, I think from my experience just in Western Pennsylvania, a lot of people probably haven't heard of the cognitive interview. They're probably not familiar with the best practice interviewing protocols. So if they're not aware of it, clearly they're not using it. I don't know how much training that people get in the cognitive interview in this particular area. So these are some questions that should be on your mind when you're evaluating the interview, because really the quality of the information that you're getting from an interview is at least in part determined by the interview itself, no doubt about it, right? So the way and the methods that you use are gonna have a fairly big impact on people's recollections. And these are just kind of a summary of all the other things. Of course, one of the highlights is suggestive and leading questions, right? You don't want to give eyewitnesses information. You don't want to introduce information that they're not aware of. And you certainly don't want to do this early on in the interview before you've got their recall of a particular event, okay? So hopefully we talked about, yeah, memory can be good, but it's sensitive, it's very delicate, and depends upon the type of techniques that you use. Certainly why you don't always see great interviews could be a lack of training in some cases, could be because it's difficult, but it can certainly have some pretty bad impacts on quantity and accuracy. If you get a chance to look into something like the McMartin preschool case, for example, is a good practical example of how interviewing witnesses. In that case, it was children, where police interviewing plays a big role, and you don't really think about it a whole lot. Maybe you guys do, but it seems to me that the general public doesn't always think about, especially with adult witnesses, that the way in which you interview people is going to affect the recall that you get. You guys would know the answer to this question better than me, and maybe it's something that's on your minds. I know that Pennsylvania allows for testimony about eyewitness memory and identification issues, but as far as police interviewing, I don't know if that is in fact the case with adults, so I think there may be some kind of distinguishing characteristics there as far as testimony and evaluation of that kind of thing. So I think, again, I'm not an attorney, that's what I learned in law school. That's the first thing I learned in law school, is to tell people that I'm not an attorney, so can't be sued for, unauthorized practice of law or something like that. Is that what it is? So I still remember that, along with the Iraq method, which I still remember. So take that with a grain of salt. But you should definitely critically examine it. And there's certainly people that do this kind of work and have this generalized knowledge about what's a good or a bad interview to help you guys that is all I have for you, but I will now take questions. I'm happy to do that. I think I still have time. I think I went
Yeah, I
through
think one or two questions. would
one or
be-
two questions. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I was thinking about your comment that we don't really have words to describe faces.
Yeah.
And I was curious whether it's just that normal people don't have words to describe faces, or that there aren't even experts or an expert language for describing cases. I'm thinking about describing wine, for example. I don't have words to describe wine. I know what I like and don't like, but I don't. But I do know that experts have a language for describing wine that seems to communicate with other experts about that. Do you have any idea about faces in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're kind of, in a sense, asking, can you be kind of like a face expert or something like that? I'm not quite sure. I'm not confident enough of the answer of that to say. I mean, I think that I can speak generally that our brains don't seem to be really well able to do it, and because we don't have a language that allows us to do it, it makes it even that much more difficult to do. But I don't know. I don't quite know. I know what you're asking. I don't quite know the answer to the question. If somebody is expert at that, I think it goes back to what I said about processing holistically. Is that, you know, even if there are certainly people that are better and really good at recognizing faces, but because of the way that we generally do it, and here's what we do know from cognitive psychology, that faces are unique in how we process them, right? The way we process faces are different than how we process like a desk, for instance. So we seem to be kind of uniquely wired to process them in a particular way. Maybe that's the reason, the consequence is that we don't have great words for it because of how our brain naturally processes information. It's a very theoretical, but it's a great question. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Chad.
Well, comment. I was going to say there's certainly technical language being developed with facial recognition technology. So I'm not sure, you know, what language is being used there in constructing that technology. But something you said is more of a comment that stuck with me.
Sure.
Was the notion that witnesses may recall more details later on, because I experienced that so much as a public defender and working representing individuals where they, upon the initial meeting, they may not have remembered all of the details, but in later meetings they would recall additional information, facts, and details, which is always interesting.
And you're probably thinking, as a public defender, well, how is this going to be looked at? You know, right? I mean, even if it's accurate, are people going to believe this if it wasn't documented or something like that? Plus, like, think about the eyewitness, because I think that's an interesting comment, because the eyewitness may screen information and say, oh yeah, I do remember more, but they're probably not going to believe me, so I'm not going to
Well,
say.
I mean, like basic information. So,
Okay.
so for example, if you were at someone's house when you got arrested, there were 10 people there. Like, who do you remember? Who else was? You know, those sorts of things were always frustrating. And then I also represented children as well.
Yeah.
Which was through in a number of different dynamics as well. So.
Right. So you can see this kind of playing out in the actual cases that you had. That's real interesting. Yes, ma'am.
So I had a question about, so one of the things I was thinking about is like, can you do this presentation, or somebody like you do this presentation in every like police precinct? And that might be too much for you. So I guess I was wondering, you know, implicit bias training is a thing, right? Like, you know, they do it in schools, they do it, some police departments do it. Is there a way, I guess, to sort of translate this knowledge in a way that is, I mean, I think it's accessible, right? But in a way that can inform trainings, because I just think it should be sort of systemic knowledge. So is there a way
Right.
to spread this in a way that's more, yeah.
Yeah, more kind of widespread.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that all the different, how many police departments are there in Allegheny County? It was like hundreds or something like that, right? And I know that there's like some kind of like state programming that they kind of get. I mean, so I think one of the things, I've been thinking about this too, you know, maybe you have like state courses that maybe people like me and my colleagues can teach at a state level I think there's different organizations that do that kind of thing. But often we face difficulty with receptivity to this kind of stuff because we have to be careful because many police do good interviews. It's not like all police are bad interviewers, but I think our field we have to that difficulty of not just saying all the bad things that you're doing, but here are the good things. And so they're not, you have to have a welcoming party, and that's not always the case, I guess, too. But I think there's a lot more we can do. There's not many of us out there either, so that makes it even harder, too. But it's a great point. You had a question?
A lot of this is the opposite of how lawyers are trained to elicit information, particularly in depositions sometimes.
Right.
And there's a trend right now to have internal investigators that are not police, say HR, Title IX, be lawyers. And
Oh, yeah.
lawyers,
Interesting.
I think this is somewhat foreign to lawyers who are usually advocating for one side or the other. They're not necessarily seeking all the truth. So to me, I agree with you. This not only for like police departments, but there's a huge market right now for internal, impartial investigators, and that's the big question: is who's impartial? This is very impartial. Lawyers.
Well, you're not supposed to be, are you? I mean, isn't that your
no.
job is to be advocates, right?
It's completely different than a litigator's point of view. Everything you're saying is like they almost deliberately go the other direction.
I mean, I would imagine, aren't there times where you don't want to hear certain things, right? So you don't ask about them because you don't want to know about it because then you got to deal with it, right? That's clearly not what we're doing here, right? So, but it's an interesting application of it. If you're in a situation as an attorney where you do want to get the truth, then there's a vastly different way of doing it, than what you're describing. Yeah.
So you got to go into business.
I'm doing enough these days. I'll tell you. Yes, sir. Yeah, back there. You had a question? You did not have a question?
No, I'm just thinking about how I can monetize this.
Well, hopefully it gives you guys, I think I'm probably the only non-attorney to talk to you guys today. Hopefully that gives you a slightly different perspective, and I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.